We all think we know the Hollywood story. It's a world of dreams, painted in shimmering technicolor. A place where stars weren't just made. They were seemingly born overnight, descending from the heavens to grace the silver screen. It was a kingdom built on fantasy, a promise of happily ever after, sold to the world one movie ticket at a time. They called it the Golden Age. Most folks remember Hollywood's golden era as pure magic, don't they? Those shimmering movies in gorgeous technicolor, where stars seemed to float down from heaven itself to grace our screens. It was like watching gods and goddesses play make-believe, selling us dreams one picture show at a time. They called it the Golden Age, and boy, did we believe it. But here's the thing about fairy tales. They're awfully good at hiding the monsters lurking in the shadows. What if that whole glittering spectacle was really just the most elaborate cover-up ever pulled off? Behind all those smiles and premieres, behind those towering studio gates, there was a filing cabinet full of secrets they prayed you'd never peek into. Tonight, we're not chatting about the legends everyone knows and loves. We're talking about the other ones, the casualties, the folks who got chewed up and spit out by the very machine that was supposed to make their dreams come true. These are the voices that got silenced, the stories that got buried so deep that most people forgot they ever existed. The Hollywood machine. Now, before we dive into these stories, you've got to understand what we're dealing with here. The studio system back then wasn't just about making pictures. It was about making people. And I mean that literally. They'd take regular folks and turn them into whatever they needed. Heartthrobs, sweethearts, tough guys, girl next door types. Those 7-year contracts, they weren't just pieces of paper. They were ownership documents. The studios controlled everything. Who you could marry, what you wore to the grocery store, even how you talked to your own family. Step out of line. And they had these things called morality clauses that could end your career faster than you could say breach of contract. It was control like nobody had ever seen before. And with that kind of power comes the ability to hide things, to make inconvenient truths disappear, and to sacrifice people when it suited their bottom line. Before we dive into these 8 shocking stories that Hollywood tried to bury, if you're fascinated by the dark secrets behind the Golden Age glamour, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We're just getting started, and trust me, what you're about to hear will change how you see classic Hollywood forever. Section 1. Peg Entwistle. When dreams turn to nightmares. Let's start with a story that's become something of a Hollywood legend, though not the kind anyone likes to tell at parties. It's 1932, and Peg Entwistle is climbing that famous sign in the Hollywood Hills. But she's not going up there to take in the view. Peg wasn't some starry-eyed kid from the sticks, you know. This was a woman who'd made it on Broadway. Real theater, the kind that mattered. She'd worked with the best of them back in New York, even caught the attention of a young Bette Davis, who said she wanted to be just like Peg someday. Peg's troubles started way before Hollywood crushed her spirit. Born over in Wales back in 1908, she lost her mama when she was barely old enough to remember her face. Then, when she was just 14, her father was struck and lost his life in a hit-and-run accident right there on Park Avenue. Can you imagine? 14 years old and basically an orphan, watching her little half-brothers get shipped off to live with their uncle while she stayed behind, determined to make something of herself. But here's the remarkable thing. Despite these personal tragedies, Peg found incredible success on stage. At 17, she became the youngest actress ever recruited by the prestigious Theatre Guild. Her performance in Henrik Ibsen's The Wild Duck was so powerful that Bette Davis later said, "I knew then I wanted to be exactly like Peg Entwistle." Between 1925 and 1932, she appeared in 9 Broadway productions, working with the most respected names in theater. So when RKO Pictures came calling, promising her the moon and stars, It must have felt like all that hard work was finally paying off. She packed up her life and headed west, just like thousands of others chasing that Hollywood dream. But 1930s? Hollywood? That was a meat grinder. Plain and simple. If you didn't fit their perfect little mold, they'd toss you aside without a second thought. Peg landed a part in this picture called 13 Women. Should have been her big break, right? Wrong. The studio took one look at the finished product, decided they didn't like it, and started chopping it up in the editing room. Peg's scenes got cut down to almost nothing. Then came the real kick in the teeth. RKO dropped her contract, just like that. All her dreams, all that talent, all those years of hard work, and they showed her the door, like she was nothing. After losing her studio contract, Peg moved in with her Uncle Harold in his modest Beechwood Canyon home. Harold was a stage actor himself, so he understood the business, but even he couldn't provide the kind of support his niece needed. Friends said she grew more and more withdrawn in those final weeks, though she kept up that graceful, composed front, always the professional, always the actress. On September 16th, 1932, Peg told her uncle she was headed to the drugstore to meet some friends. It was a lie. Instead, she made her way up those dark, winding trails toward that big, lit-up sign overlooking the city. Back then, it didn't say Hollywood. It said Hollywood Land, advertising some real estate development. But to everyone below, it meant the same thing, the Dream Factory. She found a maintenance ladder on the back of that towering letter H and climbed up 45 feet into the night sky. She left her coat folded neatly at the bottom, along with her purse. Inside that purse was a note, short and heartbreaking. I am afraid. I am a coward. I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain. P.E. From the top of that H, Peg Antwistle ended her own life. A hiker found her body 2 days later, and the story became front-page news across the country. Here's what really gets me about this whole thing. Supposedly, and I say supposedly because nobody's ever proven it, a letter arrived at her uncle's house just days later. An offer for a lead role in a new play. The character she would have played? A young woman driven to take her own life. Now, whether that story's true or not, it sure captures something awful about this town, doesn't it? Peg Antwistle became known as the Hollywood Sign Girl. Her personal tragedy twisted into some kind of macabre tourist attraction. They say her ghost still wanders around up there, leaving behind the scent of gardenias, though there's no proof she ever had any connection to that particular flower. Section 2, Frances Farmer, the woman they couldn't break. Now, if Peg's story shows us what happens when Hollywood discards someone, Frances Farmer's story shows us what happens when they decide to destroy someone on purpose. And let me tell you, Frances was everything those studio bosses should have wanted. Gorgeous, talented, and smart as a whip. But that last part, that's what got her in trouble. Frances's rebellious streak showed up early. Back in high school in Seattle, she wrote this essay called God Dies that won her a $100 prize, but stirred up a hornet's nest in her conservative hometown. Then, while she was in college, she won another contest, this one from some left-wing newspaper that offered a trip to Soviet Russia as the prize. Her mother pitched a fit, but Frances went anyway. This was 1935, mind you, when just mentioning Russia could get you labeled a communist. When Frances hit Hollywood in the mid-30s, she was like a breath of fresh air, and that scared the hell out of the studio executives. See, this was a time when stars were supposed to be pretty dolls who smiled on cue and kept their mouths shut. Frances? She called Hollywood a shallow, artificial place. She dressed plain, drove a beat-up car instead of some fancy convertible, and had the audacity to leave town at the height of her career to do serious theater on Broadway. Her marriage to actor Leif Erikson in 1936 was another thumb in the eye to studio conventions. They eloped to Yuma, Arizona, completely avoiding the kind of publicity wedding spectacle that Paramount would have loved to orchestrate. The relationship was passionate but volatile, ultimately cracking under the pressure of Hollywood's demands and their own artistic ambitions. To the suits at Paramount, Frances wasn't acting like a star. She was acting like a rebel. And if there's one thing the studio system couldn't tolerate, it was rebellion. They started labeling her difficult, which was Hollywood code for this woman won't do what we tell her to do. As her reputation for being hard to handle grew, something funny happened to her career. The good roles started drying up. Suddenly, instead of A pictures, she was getting stuck in B movies. The pressure mounted, and Frances, feeling isolated and professionally stifled, started turning to alcohol and amphetamines just to cope. Her fiery independence began curdling into public outbursts and erratic behavior. Things came to a head in October 1942 when she was arrested for driving under the influence. At her hearing, her behavior was so volatile that they literally had to drag her, screaming, from the courtroom. That incident severely damaged whatever was left of her public image. Making Frances's troubles worse was her complicated relationship with her controlling mother, Lillian. Their dynamic was toxic. Lillian had her own unfulfilled theatrical ambitions and seemed to live through her daughter's success, while simultaneously disapproving of her choices. This complex relationship would later play a crucial role in what happened next. Instead of jail time, following legal proceedings and psychiatric evaluations where her mother testified against her, Frances was sent to a psychiatric facility. It was the beginning of a 7-year nightmare through the mental health system of the 1940s. Frances Farmer was effectively erased from the industry that had built her up. She ended up at Western State Hospital, an overcrowded, underfunded institution where the treatments were nothing short of barbaric. Frances endured hydrotherapy, being submerged in freezing water for hours. She was subjected to insulin shock therapy, a procedure that induced comas. She received electroconvulsive treatments as often as 3 times a week for months on end. Now here's where the story gets even darker, if you can believe that. For years, people claimed that Frances underwent a lobotomy procedure, but hospital records and family testimonies have thoroughly debunked that particular horror. Still, what actually happened to her was bad enough. She was essentially a prisoner of a psychiatric system that understood very little about mental health. When Frances finally got out in 1950, after nearly 7 years locked away, she was a changed woman. She tried to rebuild her career, but Hollywood's doors were mostly closed to her. The message was crystal clear. If you challenge the system will not just defeat you, it will erase you. Despite everything she'd been through, Frances showed remarkable resilience in her later years. In 1957, while doing summer stock theater in Indianapolis, she was offered a job hosting an afternoon movie show on local television. Frances Farmer Presents became a surprise hit, running for 6 years and giving her some measure of dignity and independence in her final chapter. Frances spent her remaining years in relative obscurity, eventually passing away in 1970. Her incredible talent overshadowed by a legacy of scandal and institutional abuse. Her story stands as a stark reminder of what happened to women who refused to play by Hollywood's rules. Section 3. Jean Harlo and the Mystery in Beverly Hills. Now let's talk about Jean Harlo, because her story shows us something different. What happens when the studios will do absolutely anything to protect their investments, even if it means covering up what might be a crime. In 1932, Jean was the biggest sensation in the world. The blonde bombshell was MGM's Golden Goose, a comedic talent with a sultry persona that packed movie theaters from coast to coast. Her image was worth millions, which made her marriage to Paul Byrne all the more intriguing to the gossip columnists. Born Harlean Carpenter in 1911, Jean's life was marked by health struggles from the very beginning. At 5, she contracted meningitis. At 15, she battled scarlet fever, an illness that damaged her kidneys and would eventually contribute to her early passing. Throughout it all, her mother, Jean Bello, maintained an iron grip on her daughter's life and career. Their relationship was so intertwined that Mama Jean once told reporters, "She was always all mine." Despite her bombshell image, Jean was beloved by cast and crew for her down-to-earth nature. They called her Baby, and she'd chat with everyone on set, from the biggest stars to the lowliest grips. Her comedic talent, especially in pictures like Dinner at 8, proved she was much more than just a pretty face with platinum hair. Paul Byrne was a quiet MGM producer, 21 years older than Jean. Not exactly the kind of man you'd expect to see with Hollywood's hottest sex symbol, but they seemed happy enough, at least publicly. That happiness lasted exactly 2 months. On September 5th, 1932, the butler found Paul in their Beverly Hills bedroom. He'd suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the head, with a pistol lying nearby. Everything pointed to self-inflicted harm. But here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean suspicious as hell. The first call that Butler made wasn't to the police. It was to MGM. Before the cops even knew there was a problem, studio executives were reportedly trooping through that bedroom, doing God knows what to the scene. Producer Samuel Marks later claimed that Irving Thalberg himself, MGM's head of production, was there before the authorities arrived, allegedly tampering with evidence. While this claim remains disputed, what's not disputed is that the studio responded before law enforcement. When the police finally showed up, they found a note that was supposedly from Paul. It read, "Dearest dear, unfortunately, this is the only way to make good the frightful wrong I have done you and to wipe out my abject humiliation. I love you, Paul. You understand that last night was only a comedy." Now, what kind of note is that? What frightful wrong? What comedy? The thing raised more questions than it answered. Jean told the grand jury she had no earthly idea what any of it meant. But MGM, they had a story ready to go. According to some accounts, Louis B. Mayer himself crafted the official narrative that Paul had taken his own life because he was unable to satisfy his bombshell wife intimately. But here's what makes this whole thing smell fishy. Paul Byrne had a secret, a big one. He'd been supporting a common-law wife named Dorothy Millette for years after she suffered a mental breakdown. At the time of Paul's demise, Dorothy was living up in San Francisco. Had she come down to Los Angeles that night? Had she confronted Paul? A cook at the house reported seeing a mysterious woman around the property. This theory got even more compelling when, just days after Paul's passing, Dorothy Millette jumped from a riverboat and drowned. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe she'd done something she couldn't live with. The timeline makes it tricky, though. She would have had to travel from Beverly Hills back to San Francisco, mighty fast, to be seen checking out of her hotel. We'll probably never know for sure what really happened that night. What we do know is that MGM moved heaven and earth to manage the situation. They reportedly worked to erase Dorothy Millette from the story entirely. Thanks to the studio's intervention, Jean's career survived the scandal, but the mystery of what really happened in that Beverly Hills bedroom was never solved. Was it self-inflicted harm, or was it something more sinister, covered up by one of Hollywood's most powerful studios to protect their multi-million-dollar asset? Just 5 years later, Jean's own story came to a tragic end. In May 1937, while filming Saratoga with Clark Gable, she began complaining of fatigue and severe abdominal pain. Her symptoms were initially dismissed as flu, but her condition deteriorated rapidly. The childhood scarlet fever had severely damaged her kidneys, and at age 26, Jean Harlo passed away from kidney failure. MGM, determined to complete the film despite losing their star, used body doubles and camera tricks to finish Saratoga, which became one of the year's biggest hits, a final exploitation of their platinum blonde asset. Section 4. George Reeves, the man who couldn't fly. Let's shift gears and talk about George Reeves, because his story shows us that even in the 1950s, when the old studio system was supposedly loosening its grip, Hollywood still had ways of making inconvenient truths disappear. In the 50s, George was one of the most recognizable faces in America as Superman on television. Kids everywhere looked up to him as their hero. But behind the cape, George was trapped, not by kryptonite, but by typecasting and a complicated personal life that would ultimately cost him everything. George's career had started with real promise. Born George Kiefer Brewer in Iowa back in 1914, he'd trained at the prestigious Pasadena Playhouse before landing a significant role as one of the Tarleton twins in Gone with the Wind. His early trajectory suggested leading man potential, but World War II interrupted his momentum. He served honorably in the Army Air Forces, but when he returned, Hollywood had changed, and his opportunities had dried up. For years, George had been involved in a relationship with Toni Mannix, the wife of MGM's powerful executive, Eddie Mannix. It was one of those open secrets that Hollywood was full of. Everybody knew, nobody talked about it, and Eddie apparently looked the other way. But by 1959, George had ended that affair and gotten engaged to a younger woman named Leonore Lemon. Though Superman had made him famous, the role had become a prison. The show's modest budget meant George earned far less than people assumed, about $2,500 a week when filming, with long stretches between seasons offering no income. More frustrating was the typecasting. Directors wouldn't cast him in serious roles because audiences only saw Superman. He took his influence on children seriously, though. He quit smoking in public and was careful about his behavior, knowing young fans were watching his every move. On June 16, 1959, in the early morning hours, police were called to George's home in Benedict Canyon. They found him in his upstairs bedroom, deceased from a single gunshot wound to the head. His fiancée Leonore and several friends were downstairs at a late-night party. The official ruling came quickly, self-inflicted harm. But that ruling raised more questions than it answered. The scene contained several inconsistencies that investigators have debated for decades. The Luger pistol was found between his feet, an unusual position for someone who'd harmed themselves. No fingerprints were found on the weapon, and reports indicate no gunshot residue was detected on George's hands. While there was one fatal shot, investigators reportedly found additional bullet holes in the floor of the room. Then there was the behavior of the witnesses. Leonore and her friends waited nearly 45 minutes before calling the police. Leonore's own statements that night were bizarre, to say the least. As George went upstairs, she reportedly told her guests he's going upstairs to hurt himself. When the shot rang out, she allegedly announced, "I told you, he's done it." Later, when questioned, she claimed she was only kidding. George's mother never believed the official story and hired a private investigator. A second examination reportedly revealed bruises on George's head and body, suggesting a possible struggle. But then, mysteriously, the investigator dropped the case despite being paid to continue. Some folks speculated he'd been warned off. Theories started flying. Had Leonore harmed him during a drunken argument, or was it something more sinister? One persistent theory pointed to Eddie and Tony Mannix. Tony was reportedly devastated that George had left her. Eddie was a powerful executive with alleged connections to organized crime figures. Years later, in a claim that remains unverified, publicist Edward Lozzie said that a dying Tony Mannix confessed to a priest in his presence that she had arranged for George to be harmed because she was absolutely terrified of going to hell. Contrary to Leonore's claims about George being depressed over his failed career, evidence suggests his professional prospects were actually improving. He'd recently directed several episodes of Adventures of Superman and was preparing to direct a science fiction film. He'd bought a new car and was making plans for his upcoming marriage. Friends described him as optimistic and forward-looking in his final days. No one was ever charged. The case was never officially reopened. The man who played Superman, a symbol of invincibility, met a very human, very vulnerable end, and the truth remains as elusive as kryptonite, another mystery from Hollywood's golden age that was buried deeper than any of Superman's secrets. Section 5. Judy Garland, the child they destroyed. If you want to understand just how ruthless the studio system could be, you need to hear Judy Garland's story. Because if they treated their adult stars like property, they treated their child performers even worse. And nobody got it worse than the little girl born Frances Ethel Gum. Judy was born into a vaudeville family in 1922, performing by age 2, and signed to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer by 13. Can you imagine? 13 years old, and already owned, body and soul, by a corporation that would systematically destroy her childhood, her health, and ultimately, her sense of self. From the moment MGM signed her, studio executives obsessed over Judy's appearance. Louis B. Mayer himself, the head of the studio, called her "my little hunchback," a cruel reference to her slightly curved spine. Other executives told her she looked like a fat little pig with pigtails. These were grown men, talking to a child, destroying her self-esteem before she was old enough to defend herself. To control her developing figure, the studio put her on strict diets, sometimes allowing her nothing but chicken soup, coffee, and 80 cigarettes a day to suppress her appetite. 80 cigarettes. To a child. When diets failed to achieve their desired results, they introduced her to pills, the beginning of a dependency that would haunt her for the rest of her life. At just 16, while filming The Wizard of Oz, the movie that would make her an international icon, Judy's daily routine was horrifying by any standard. Studio doctors prescribed amphetamines to suppress her appetite and provide energy for grueling 18-hour workdays. followed by sleeping pills to help her rest at night. MGM presented this as normal industry practice, completely ignoring the devastating consequences of feeding addictive substances to a developing teenager. The studio's control extended far beyond her physical appearance. MGM dictated who she could date, arranging publicity outings with young male stars like Mickey Rooney for the cameras. When she began developing genuine romantic feelings for composer David Rose, the studio initially opposed their relationship because it didn't fit their marketing plans. When they finally married in 1941, with Judy, just 19, MGM executives openly disapproved, believing marriage would damage her wholesome image. By her early 20s, what should have been the prime of her career became a cycle of exhaustion, dependency, and despair. Attempting to keep up with MGM's relentless production schedule and impossible expectations, she began missing days on set. Each absence was treated not as a cry for help, but as an act of defiance. Studio executives responded by sending memos condemning her unprofessional behavior, threatening suspension, and increasing the very pressure that was already crushing her. The breaking point came in 1950. After 15 years at MGM, years that had seen her make 28 films and become one of the studio's most bankable assets, she was fired. The official reason was her unreliability, with no acknowledgement of the studio's role in creating her dependencies and psychological issues. At 28, Judy found herself cast aside by the system that had exploited her since childhood. In the years that followed, Judy achieved some of her greatest artistic triumphs: acclaimed concert performances, her 1954 film comeback in A Star Is Born, and a television series. But the damage inflicted during those formative MGM years proved impossible to fully overcome. Her struggles with addiction, financial problems, and self-worth continued throughout her life. When Judy passed away in 1969, at age 47 from an accidental overdose, it marked the final chapter in a story that had begun decades earlier in the offices of MGM executives, who saw not a talented child, but a commodity to be shaped, exploited, and discarded when no longer profitable. Section 6. Montgomery Clift, the face that couldn't be fixed. Let's talk about Montgomery Clift, because his story shows us something different. How Hollywood could break someone who seemed unbreakable, someone who had everything going for him but still couldn't escape the machine. Unlike many stars who were manufactured by the studio system, Clift arrived in Hollywood fully formed. He was a brilliant method actor who'd already established himself on Broadway, with a magnetic screen presence that made him an immediate sensation. Born into wealth in 1920, he'd been acting professionally since age 13, spending 15 years refining his craft on stage before making his film debut in 1948's The Search. His first 3 films, The Search, Red River, and The Heiress, established him as one of Hollywood's most promising leading men, earning him 2 Academy Award nominations before he turned 30. Unlike many contract players, Clift maintained his independence, refusing to sign with any studio and carefully selecting his roles, a level of autonomy almost unheard of in that era. What set Clift apart wasn't just his talent, but his authenticity. In an era of manufactured personas, he was genuinely himself, introspective, intellectual, and unwilling to conform to Hollywood's typical leading man template. He maintained a private life separate from his public image, refusing to participate in the sham relationships and publicity stunts that studios arranged for other stars. This authenticity made him both admired within the industry and somewhat suspect to studio executives accustomed to complete control. The pivotal moment came on the night of May 12, 1956. After leaving a dinner party at Elizabeth Taylor's home, he crashed his car into a telephone pole, severely injuring his face. Taylor herself rushed to the scene, reportedly crawling into the wreckage to clear broken teeth from his throat before he choked. The accident left him with a fractured jaw, broken nose, and facial lacerations that required extensive reconstructive surgery. When the bandages came off, Montgomery Clift was literally and figuratively a changed man. His face was now asymmetrical, his features subtly but unmistakably altered. With remarkable courage, he returned to complete Raintree County just 2 months after the accident. MGM rearranged the shooting schedule and used careful lighting and camera angles to minimize the visible changes, but while his face could be partially repaired, The psychological damage was profound. Already prone to anxiety about his performances, Clift began relying heavily on alcohol and painkillers to cope with both physical pain and the trauma of seeing his altered reflection. The industry that had once embraced him now viewed him as damaged goods. Director Fred Zinnemann observed, "Monty was the first actor I knew who was destroyed by the publicity department. He refused to go along with the myth they had created about him." As his dependency on substances deepened, his behavior became increasingly erratic. His once meticulous preparation for roles was replaced by struggles to simply remember his lines. Hollywood's response wasn't to offer support, but to label him difficult and unreliable, industry code words that signaled he was becoming unemployable. Despite his struggles, Clift delivered some of his most vulnerable and affecting performances in the years after his accident, including his role in Judgment at Nuremberg, 1961, which earned him his 4th Academy Award nomination. But these artistic triumphs came at an enormous personal cost. Friends described the last decade of his life as the longest gradual decline in Hollywood history. When Clift passed away alone in his New York townhouse on July 23, 1966, at age 45, the official cause was a heart attack. But the true cause was the unbearable pressure of being Montgomery Clift, of trying to maintain artistic integrity in a system designed to commercialize talent, of living authentically in an industry built on fabrication, and of facing the world with a face that no longer fully belonged to him. Section 7. Barbara Payton. From Starlet to Street Corner. If you want to see the complete life cycle of Hollywood exploitation, from discovery to destruction, you need to hear Barbara Payton's story, because her trajectory shows us just how far someone could fall when the dream machine decided they were disposable. Born Barbara Lee Redfield in Minnesota in 1927, she arrived in Hollywood in 1948 as a strikingly beautiful blonde with limited acting experience but abundant ambition. Within months, her stunning looks had caught the attention of producers, and she quickly secured a contract with Universal Studios. The machine immediately began reshaping her. They changed her last name to Payton, crafted a glamorous backstory that conveniently omitted her early marriage and child, and positioned her as Hollywood's newest sensation. By 1950, she'd moved from Universal to Warner Brothers and landed a leading role opposite James Cagney in Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye. Studio publicity departments touted her as the next big thing, arranging dates with eligible leading men and ensuring her photographs appeared in all the right magazines. She embodied the Hollywood dream, a small-town girl transformed overnight into a glamorous star, complete with a Beverly Hills mansion, expensive cars, and designer clothes. But beneath the carefully constructed facade, Barbara was already showing signs of the self-destructive behavior that would ultimately consume her. Unlike many stars who submitted to studio control, she refused to conform to Hollywood's moral expectations. Her wild parties, heavy drinking, and very public affairs made her a liability in an era when morality clauses were strictly enforced. When she became entangled in a notorious love triangle with actors Franchot Tone and Tom Neal, which culminated in a violent brawl that left Tone hospitalized with serious injuries, the studios began to distance themselves. The incident made headlines nationwide, painting Barbara as a dangerous femme fatale who destroyed men's lives. By 1955, just 5 years after her breakthrough role, Barbara had been blacklisted by every major studio. Her drinking had become uncontrollable, her behavior increasingly erratic, and her reputation unsalvageable by even the most skilled publicity departments. Without the support system that had created her image, she quickly unraveled. What followed was one of the most precipitous falls from grace in Hollywood history. By the late 1950s, Barbara had lost her home, her savings, and any prospect of legitimate work. Desperate and addicted, she began trading the only commodity Hollywood had ever truly valued: her body. By 1962, she was working the streets of Sunset Boulevard, sometimes for as little as $5, often just blocks away from theaters that had once displayed her name on marquees. In a cruel irony, she was now engaging in the very transactions that Hollywood had always conducted, just without the veneer of respectability that studios provided. Barbara's memoir, I Am Not Ashamed, published in 1963, offered a rare, unvarnished look at Hollywood's disposability of women. Unlike the sanitized studio biographies, her book detailed her descent with brutal honesty. Few in the industry acknowledged her existence by this point, preferring to pretend that such catastrophic falls didn't happen to their girls. When Barbara passed away in 1967, she was 39 years old, but looked decades older, her once stunning beauty ravaged by alcoholism, addiction, and the hardships of her final years. The official cause was heart and liver failure. The Los Angeles Times, which had once featured glamorous photographs of her at premieres, now ran a brief obituary noting she had passed away in poverty. Section 8. Olive Thomas, Hollywood's first victim. Let's go back to the very beginning, because before there was even a Hollywood sign for Peg Antwistle to climb, there was Olive Thomas, beautiful, vivacious, and destined to become Hollywood's first major scandal. Her 1920 passing by poison in a Paris hotel room shocked the world and offered an early glimpse of the darkness that lurked beneath the glittering surface of the emerging film industry. Born Olive Duffy in 1894 to a working-class family in Pennsylvania, she escaped factory work by winning a newspaper beauty contest in 1914. With her perfect heart-shaped face and luminous eyes, she quickly found success as an artist's model, becoming the inspiration for iconic illustrations. Her image adorned magazine covers and advertisements, making her one of the most recognizable faces in America even before she appeared on screen. She joined the Ziegfeld Follies, where her beauty caught the eye of Florenz Ziegfeld himself, who featured her prominently and reportedly carried on an affair with her despite his marriage. This was the pattern that would define much of Olive's career. Powerful men recognizing her beauty and finding ways to exploit it for their own purposes. Thomas's transition to film was swift and successful. By 1917, she had signed with Selznick Pictures, where her natural charisma and photogenic qualities made her an immediate hit with audiences. Unlike many early silent stars who relied on exaggerated expressions, Thomas possessed a remarkably modern, naturalistic acting style. Her films, particularly The Flapper, 1920, captured the spirit of the emerging jazz age. Her marriage to Jack Pickford in 1916 united two of Hollywood's most powerful families and created what the press called the perfect couple. Behind the glamorous facade, however, the relationship was troubled by Jack's infidelities, hard partying, and financial irresponsibility. Despite these challenges, they maintained a united public image, understanding even then the commercial value of their combined star power. In September 1920, Thomas and Pickford traveled to Paris for a second honeymoon, intended to repair their marriage. On the night of September 5th, after returning to their suite at the Hotel Ritz, following an evening of night clubbing, Thomas consumed a large dose of mercury bichloride, a highly toxic compound prescribed to Jack for his chronic condition. Whether she mistook the labeled bottle for something else in the darkened bathroom, as Jack claimed, or whether something more sinister occurred, remains one of Hollywood's enduring mysteries. Thomas's final hours were agonizing. The poison causes a slow, painful demise as it destroys the kidneys. Jack summoned physicians, but there was no effective treatment. Thomas suffered for days, reportedly blinded and unable to speak, before passing away on September 10th at age 25. French authorities ruled it accidental, accepting Pickford's account without significant investigation. He quickly had her body prepared for transport and returned to America before more questions could be raised, a move that some later viewed with suspicion. The American press turned Thomas's tragedy into a media sensation. Newspapers speculated wildly about various scenarios, emphasized the couple's jazz-age lifestyle of drinking and dancing, during Prohibition no less, and implied that moral degeneracy had led to her demise. The publicity was so damaging that Adolph Zukor, head of Paramount Pictures, implemented the first version of the morality clauses that would later become standard in all Hollywood contracts. The industry's handling of Thomas's passing established precedents that would be refined over subsequent decades. Her production company moved quickly to protect their investment, releasing her final film just weeks after her demise and capitalizing on the publicity. The Pickford family used their influence to shape the narrative and minimize damage to Jack's reputation. The industry closed ranks, demonstrating for the first time its capacity to control information and protect its own interests above truth or justice. A century later, Olive Thomas remains largely forgotten, except by film historians. Yet her tragic end marked a crucial turning point, the moment when Hollywood recognized both its vulnerability to scandal and its power to manage it. The patterns established in the aftermath of her tragedy would be repeated countless times, as the studio system perfected its techniques of image control, narrative manipulation, and the sacrificing of individual lives for the greater good of the industry. These 8 stories, Peg Entwistle, Frances Farmer, Jean Harlo, George Reeves, Judy Garland, Montgomery Clift, Barbara Payton, and Olive Thomas, represent different chapters in a much larger, darker book about Hollywood's golden age. They show us the various faces of victimization under the old studio system: the crushed dreamer, the punished rebel, the protected asset, the inconvenient witness, the exploited child, the broken perfectionist, the discarded woman, and the industry's first casualty. For every name we remember, there are countless others we don't. Aspiring performers who faced exploitation, child stars whose innocence was stolen, and people whose lives were disrupted by an industry focused on profit above human dignity. The golden age of Hollywood was built on control over contracts, over images, and ultimately, over truth itself. It gave its stars the world, but it demanded their souls in exchange. It created fantasies that captivated generations, but the real-life stories of its stars were often tragedies, not fairy tales. That old studio system is gone now, and performers today have more power and protection than their predecessors ever dreamed of. But the echoes of that dark past remain. The power dynamics, the pressure, the scandals, and the cover-ups haven't vanished from Hollywood. They've just evolved. These victim stories matter because they pull back the curtain on the myth and remind us that behind every flawless image, there's a human being. They represent the secrets Hollywood tried to bury, but their voices, once silenced, now refuse to be forgotten. The victims of Hollywood's golden age deserve to be remembered not just as cautionary tales, but as real people whose dreams were exploited by a system that valued profit over human dignity. We're committed to bringing you more of these forgotten stories. So if you believe these voices need to be heard, please subscribe to our channel and share this video with others who appreciate real Hollywood history. What other golden age mysteries would you like us to investigate? Tell us in the comments.